Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director here at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Flight and Survival: Jewish Refugees in Mexico in the Holocaust, and features Dr. Yael Siman, Professor of Social and Political Sciences at Iberoamericana University and visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, were first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocity and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event is part of the 2024-25 Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center, also known colloquially as the KHC, and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium entitled Circuitous Exchanges. And the event today is co-sponsored by 8 organizations around the country. They include the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Reeves Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, the Salmon Francis Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, and the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. We're also grateful for the support of our QCC colleagues who are integral in producing today's hybrid event, including Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer Stephen DiDio, Barana Soman, the KHC's Administrative Coordinator, along with the media services, IT, marketing, and public safety teams, including shout-outs to Jesse Pina, Phil Roncaroni, and Mahir Hossein. After Dr. Siman's presentation, we'll host a short Q&A. And for those of you watching online, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now to kick things off, please join me in welcoming one of this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows, Dr. Raquel Corona, lecturer in the English Department at Queensborough Community College. Dr. Corona began her time at QCC as part of the CUNY START program in 2013 as an advisor and program coordinator helping students adjust to college life. She received her PhD in English from St. John's University, and her dissertation is a rhetorical exploration of how transnationalism affects the circulation of stories about the Latinx woman's body and sex. The years she spent as a student affairs professional supporting students outside the classroom in the pursuit of college education have truly shaped her teaching pedagogy and commitment to student-centered and socially just teaching practices. Dr. Corona, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So my tremendous honor is to introduce Yael. And so we will begin. Yael Siman has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. She's currently a visiting scholar for the Center for Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University at New Brunswick. She is also an associate professor at the Department of Social and Political Sciences at Iberoamericana University in Mexico City. She teaches college and graduate classes on the Holocaust, genocide, and contemporary violence. She's also taught at the Geseg Summer School, University of Graz, Austria, the Summer Institute for the Study of the Holocaust and Jewish Civilization at Northwestern University in Illinois, and Classrooms Without Borders. She is part of the UNESCO Latin American Network and associate researcher at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. In 2024 to 2025, Siman was granted a fellowship grant by the Memorial Foundation for Jewish culture for her research project on Jewish and Spanish memories of violence, forced mobility, and exile in Mexico. Her most recent publications include Victim Activists in Mexico, Social and Political Mobilization Amid Extreme Violence and Disappearances, which is co-authored and has been published by the Lexicon Books in 2024, just recently. And she's also published The Holocaust in Latin America Migration, Resettlement, and Memory, which is co-edited and it's forthcoming by Palgrave Macmillan. So please join me in welcoming Yael Siman to give us just a part of her great research knowledge. So come on up here.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Laura Cohen and Dr. Raquel Corona for the invitation. I feel truly honored to be at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, and I thank those who are in person today as well as those who are online. As you can see, Jewish refugees immigrated to Latin America to multiple places from Europe during the Holocaust. But if you look at the numbers, although, as I will explain a little bit later, they're not very precise, those who came to Mexico, for example, were numbered only in the 1,000. In contrast, for example, to those who went to Chile and numbered 12,000, or to Brazil, 25,500. You can see that the total of the Jewish immigrants to the region were about 100,000 people. In comparison, as I said, Mexico stood as a very marginal place of refuge compared to other Latin American countries. It is surprising, for example, that even Colombia received more Jewish refugees than Mexico. However, later estimates of Jewish refugees who came to Mexico point out a little bit a higher number, although still a small one. According to historian Haim Avni, for example, there were between 1,850 and 250 Jews that came to Mexico between 1933 and 1945. So it is still a strikingly small number. While Mexico holds a central geopolitical position in the region, as I said before, it played only a marginal place in terms of the reception of Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. There are no precise numbers for the post-war years, but in recent research that I have conducted with historian Daniela Glaser, we have estimated only a few hundred survivors that came to Mexico in the aftermath of the war. According to academic studies, Mexico had an open door policy towards Jewish refugees or immigrants in the 1920s, but a closed door policy towards Jewish refugees of Nazism in the 1930s. Historians Haim Avni, Daniela Glaser, and also sociologist Judith Boxer-Liberant have pointed out that Mexico's immigration policy towards Jews was restrictive, selective, and even discretional. Thus, according to Avni, for example, Mexico was not a refuge for Jews. He makes this very bold claim. This contrasts, so the Jewish case contrasts with the exile of Spanish Republicans that came to Mexico during the same period. It has been estimated that about 20,000 Spanish Republicans came to Mexico, compared the approximately 2,000 Jews that came in the same period. Jewish immigration to Mexico was officially prohibited, although this was through a confidential circular in April of 1934. And it prohibited specifically Jewish immigration because Jews were considered non-assimilable to the Mexican nation. I will talk a little bit more about this later. And this circular, which was not unique to Mexico, many other Latin American countries had confidential circulars that also prohibited Jewish immigration, remained in effect until 1937. but then it was replaced by other provisions that continue to prohibit Jewish immigration to Mexico. It is striking the gap in numbers that I mentioned before, and that tells you already something very important about the differentiated policy that the Mexican government held towards one group of refugees and another. This is a photo of the Colegio de Mexico, which was founded by Spanish Republicans. And it's one of the most important academic and research institutions today in our country. It is important to consider, although I don't have time to go deeply into this, but it is important to consider the national context at the time. So, for example, Mexico's ethnic profile and the role of immigration was very unique to Mexico and other Indo-European countries. This is a classification that was brought to the fore by historian Avni. And this contrasts with other European countries or countries that received European immigration, such as Argentina. So Mexico is considered an Indo-American country with a predominantly mestizo population. That means a mix of European and indigenous ancestry, and a significant indigenous presence. And immigration remained very low in Mexico, even by 1910, after President Porfirio Diaz had promoted European immigration to Mexico. Immigration was less than 1% of the national population. And I'm sorry, the Argentina is an Indo-European, and Mexico is an Indo-American country. And thus, the great waves of global migration, which peaked during these years, Avni says, largely bypassed Mexico. Some other factors need to be considered. One, for example, as I said before, is Mexico's geopolitical position, its proximity to the United States, which shaped the US's foreign policy, and it had a big impact on Mexico. Also, President Lázaro Cárdenas's economic policy, such as the nationalization of the oil industry, which happened in March of 1938, and also the resulting tensions between Mexico's government, the US, and England because of this policy of nationalization. Here you can see photos of both Plutarco Elías Calles and Lázaro Cárdenas, our former presidents. And it's important to consider some other factors regarding the national context. One of them has to do with the fact that Mexico was coming out of a revolution, a very important revolution in the country. So this is a post-revolutionary moment for Mexico. But also there were very strong political divides. Those who supported Calles and his legacy, and those who supported Cárdenas, who had very different national projects. And also, Mexico, when Cárdenas was in power, Mexico was grappling as other countries with the economic depression. It is very important to consider that at the time, the National Political Revolutionary Party was already well established, and the president started to, already had control over different sectors of the population. It later became the PRI, which stayed in power for over 60 years. And also there were nationalist demands or a nationalist fervor to protect the national population, and therefore this led to anti-foreign and anti-immigrant sentiment. Here you can see it's a photo of the Comité Pro Raza. You can also see that, you cannot see it, but the photo speaks for itself. This is a meeting of the Pro-Race Committee. At the time, there was also anti-Semitism and xenophobia, not only anti-Jews. In fact, there was a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment that led to a massacre in the early 20th century in the north of the country. and also a nationalist fervor against the incoming of other groups such as Arabs, so-called gypsies. We know we have to call them Romani and Sinti, but they were called that way at the time, and others. So not only against Jews, but it was particularly strong against Jews. Not only the prejudice, but also the legislation that was promulgated, as I showed with the confidential letter of 1934. There was an anti-Chinese and anti-Jewish league. There were the Golden Shirts, a fascist paramilitary group that was dismantled in 1936. There were prejudices, social prejudices shared in Mexican society, and also a pro-Nazi German community that held significant influence in some Mexican states. Still, there were also anti-fascist movements, so that's also important to consider. Figures like Vicente Lombardo Toledano were very important, for example, and the Confederation of Mexican Workers. This led to an atmosphere in which there were those who supported immigration and those who opposed immigration. However, it's very important to consider that even though the immigration law towards Jewish refuge was very restrictive, selective, and even discretional, there was the population law of 1936 introduced, on the one hand, a quota system, but at the same time, it allowed Jews to bring immediate relatives. So that's important for what's coming next in my presentation. And I have to say also that this quota system did not include Latin Americans or Spaniards. So it was still selective towards certain groups. Here you can see or read with me a fragment of the discourse that was promoted by President Cárdenas. It's a quote from his fifth address to the Mexican nation. Mexico opened its doors to the Republican elements who could not remain in their country without threats to their lives. Moreover, this was a humanitarian contribution to a people similar to ours in spirit and blood, who together with the indigenous population contributed to the formation of our national identity. So here you can get a sense of his convictions and his positioning. In a recent study that I conducted, and we published an article with historian Daniela Glaser, the title, you can see it here on this slide, we actually found that, yes, Mexico's immigration policy towards Jews was restrictive, and selective and discretional, but we cannot call it a completely closed-door policy, as it was argued before. So we decided to call it a semi-closed door policy because those about 2,000 Jews that were able to come in did it somehow. So we examined how 30 Jewish families came to Mexico between 1937 and 1949. How were they able to navigate a hostile environment, a very strict immigration law, anti-Semitism, and yet they were able to come to the country. So some of the questions that I would like to explore with you today are the following. What did Jewish refuge entail in the case of Mexico during the Holocaust? Given that, if we may call it an exceptional case, I think we can call it an exceptional case, given that, so how did Jewish refuge, how did it happen, and what did it mean for the refugees themselves? How did Jews who escaped Nazism and survived the Holocaust, because I also look at those who came after the war, manage to reach Mexico? In what ways they created a refuge, including a sense of belonging, but not only that, it's a sense of being and a sense of belonging, given the environment that was prevalent at the time, and how do those who successfully immigrated to Mexico remember their experiences of violence, forced migration, and refuge? So it is important to consider, this is a photograph of James MacDonald, the High Commissioner for Refugees at the League of Nations. It is important to consider that the Holocaust and Latin America are interconnected. They have been interconnected, although for a long time it was not regarded as such. Latin America was seen as a separate place in and disconnected from the Holocaust. But I would argue that they have been connected historically. And we can see some numbers, for example, in terms of refugees living or trying to leave Germany, in particular, 120,000 between 1933 and 1937. One third emigrated outside of Europe, another third to Palestine, and the remaining third was still in Europe. But between 1933 and 1937, when 120,000 left Europe, Latin America was not an important destination for these refugees. So in fact, when in 1935, James MacDonald visited the region, there were no concrete requests by the refugees or their families to obtain asylum in this region. It was only in 1938 that Latin America and also Mexico, as part of Latin America, became destination options for these refugees. So 1938 brought a very important change, and it marked a true refugee crisis. I would like to situate the stories of two people who came to Mexico, because when Germany, when the Anschluss happened, when Germany annexed Austria, there was still around 200,000 Jews living there, and among them were Stephen Kalmar, a young adult, and Fini Vogel, who was a small child. Both lived in Vienna and left their home in 1937 and 1938, respectively, but they had very different migration journeys to Mexico. So I will talk a little bit more about them. Fini and her mother, Anna, you can see Fini on the left photo. Fini and her mother, Anna, attempted to escape from Vienna to France, but they were unsuccessful. Since Fini's mother had been born in Istanbul, Turkey, they managed to get the Turkish consul in Vienna to issue them entry visas. After a couple of years living there, Fini's parents decided to travel to India, passing through Iraq. And finally, with the help of the Polish consul in Bombay, they boarded a ship with a group of non-Jewish Poles heading to Mexico. Fini's family wanted to enter the United States, but they were unable to do so and had to temporarily settle in the Santa Rosa estate, which had been turned into a refugee camp. Sometime later, Fini was taken in first, followed by her parents, but not without tensions by Jewish families in Mexico. Fini tells in her memoir that she had a very uneasy welcome by the host Jewish family when she left the Santa Rosa estate. Stefan Kalmar and his wife, Edith, traveled from Austria to Sweden. They settled in Stockholm for 2 years before immigrating to Mexico with the help of a Swedish socialist newspaper, the mediation of the newspaper's editor and the local Jewish community. And Stefan also recounts how the Mexican consul in Stockholm was very anti-Semitic, and it was only through the intermediation of the editor of the Swedish newspaper that he was finally granted his entry visa to Mexico. He arrived to Mexico, they arrived, and by the way, his wife Edith was 8 months pregnant. They arrived to Mexico in 1940. Fini and her parents arrived in 1943. Almost immediately, Stefan Kalmar reported to the Jewish main agency in Mexico City, and I have found the format that he filled out at the time. So, as you know, immigration takes a village. So you need many actors, multiple decisions, and procedures. So in her book on Welcome Exiles, my colleague and friend Daniela Glesser has identified some of them. Among them, we find consulates and legations, immigration organizations, shipping companies, the laws, whether they're favorable or not, bureaucratic procedures, visas, government authorities, diplomatic relations, economic calculations, and the role of international and local organizations. So in the case of Mexico, we do see the interplay of, for example, the Liga Pro Cultura Alemana, pro-German culture, or the Acción Republicana Austriaca, Austrian Republican Action, intersecting with other organizations such as the Jewish Labor Committee of New York, but we also see Hayas or the Joint helping some of these Jewish refugees. And in the case of Mexico, as I will show, the families played a very important role. Now, this is a topic that we talk about every day in Mexico, and it's called corruption. So we had corruption in the past, and we have corruption today. So some refugees actually report in their testimonies that they had to pay high fees to get a visa. I've also found in recent research of the files of refugees and survivors at the Migration National Archive that there are gaps in the procedure, because I see a lot of letters that reject the requests of family members to bring them, and then suddenly, magically, there is a letter of approval. So there are gaps, and I assume it has to be, at least in part, with corruption. Otherwise, how come the matter was addressed and solved if it had been rejected for long, sometimes for years? And in an interview that Stefan Kalmar gave to the Holocaust Center in San Francisco in 1991, he says, and I quote, "And we were taken to Mexico, to Veracruz in that boat. It was the Siboney via New York, and we had a lot of trouble in landing Veracruz. It was not easy. Afterwards, I heard that we were the only ones that land without bribing the immigration officers there, or having been expected by relatives or others who had arranged the release. We didn't expect that we had to do that, and we were the last of the boat to get out." So that also speaks about the important role of corruption. But corruption happened not only in Mexico, it also happened in Europe. So it was present throughout the whole process of migrating. And then we have a graph. So I would like to share with you, you can look at it, and I do have a lot to say about it, but I only have 10 more minutes to finish the talk. But one interesting thing that you can see here is the peak of the number of refugees who came to Mexico in 1941, and also another peak in 1946. And then for the rest of the time, you see some ups, but very small ones. And I have to say, this is not a representative sample. It's about 100 people that were taken into account, and it's based on different sources, including the Migration Archives in Mexico, the Center for Jewish Documentation in Mexico, testimonies, memoirs, and also international archives. However, every time I add a name, I don't see the pattern changing much. So if Mexico had a closed-door policy towards Jewish refugees, under Cárdenas, how come we see a peak precisely when Cárdenas was still the Mexican president? And if the immigration policy of Mexico was restrictive even after the war, which is what I assume it was, given what I found in the files of the people, it took them very long to get into the country, and some were not able to get in. So under the other president, Ávila Camacho, why do we see that peak precisely in 1946? We do know, or we have a hunch, maybe it's not yet hard knowledge, it's just a hunch, that the immigration policy of Mexico began to change and became more flexible in the 1950s. There's a lot to say about this graph, but I will continue. Maybe you want to ask more questions later. So Daniela and I found that in terms of the networks and the actors that helped these refugees come to Mexico, 55% gained entry because they had relatives in the country, and the relatives made huge efforts to bring them. Or close to 17% entered with the help of political networks, such as the League of German Culture that I mentioned before, or the Society for Culture and Aid, a subsidiary of the Jewish Labor Committee of New York, and another 70% entered independently, albeit with the help of other people. It may be a local lawyer, it may be someone who knew someone else, and many of these people have remained invisible because there are no records of them. And 10% were helped by friends, employees, or just other people. There was also a group of investors, but very few. We found very few of those. So the efforts of the families to bring the relatives were enormous. They required funds, they required to pay for the ship tickets, they required contacts, they required legal assistance. The processing of their application was long. It took a long time. It was delayed in many times. And here we see a photo of Daniel Wolfowitz. The case of the Wolfowitz family is very interesting because her uncle, Arturo Wolfowitz, was one of the main leaders of the Jewish community at the time. He had contacts, he had all kinds of resources. He made a huge effort to bring them, and it took him several years to be able to do so. Finally, they were able to enter the country. If I'm not mistaken, it was in 1942. But after a very difficult and very challenging process. So the quote by Daniel Wolfowitz, I think, illustrates it very clearly. And I quote from her, this is, I believe, from her memoir. Thank God my uncle Arturo was here in Mexico. Otherwise, we would have never gotten out. There were also these political rescue networks, which I mentioned before, but they helped mainly communists, socialists, left-wing intellectuals, and Jews fell into that category if they had that political positioning. Otherwise, they wouldn't fall into that sort of privileged group, given that they were considered political, under the political asylum law. Now, in terms of the experiences of violence, the concentration camps emerge in these narratives, even and in also the formats that they had to fill out, or the forms that they had to fill out, the refugees, because the Center for Jewish Documentation has a collection of 66 files. And many of them, they were asked, were you imprisoned in a Nazi prison or camp? And many of them say that they were. So that emerges both in their trajectory as well as in their narrative. Here you can see, this is a very famous case, Anne Segers and Laszlo Radvani. These are images of their immigration documents. In fact, this is an image of the foreigner registration form that they had to fill out in Mexico. And for them, it was, even though it was also difficult because they fled to France and he was sent to a concentration camp, and then they wanted to go to the US, but they couldn't. And then via the US, finally, they came to Mexico. And the journey was not easy, as Anne Segers described it. They left Europe via Marseille. It was a long journey from Marseille to Martinique, Dominican Republic, and very small Caribbean harbors. But they finally got to Mexico and became very active in the exile political community of Mexico. It is interesting to note, and here you see an image of one of the formats that, or I don't know, the surveys that they had to fill out for the Jewish community of Mexico, that many of them had family in the United States. So I just put one example here, but the case of B.A. Breyer, and the refugee came from Hungary originally, but then went to Vienna, where that person lived for 53 years. And the reason for leaving was persecution. And then the person came to Mexico in 1939 via an airplane with a tourist visa, which is not the most common case. And finally, the person, I'm sorry, I said bueno in Spanish. The person writes or told the Jewish agency that he had his wife and his daughter were living in Newark, New Jersey. So I'm not sure how many of these 66 people left to the US afterwards, or how many ended up staying in Mexico, but they did have some relatives in the US, many of them, and we know for sure that Mexico was not the preferred refugee option for most of them. It's really rare to find someone saying, I wanted to go there. So they most say, I wanted to go to the United States, but they were unable to do so. All right, in terms of visas, so there were multiple visas that they would get and that allow them to get to Mexico. Of course, in addition to the exit visa, the transit visa, but then the entry visa. And some of them came as family immigrants. In fact, many of them came as such, but this was only a temporary visa. So after 5 years, they had, first of all, every year they had to renew it. And after 5 years, they could apply to the Ministry of Interior and request to change the temporary visa to a permanent visa. Then it was called imigrado, instead of imigrante. And they also had political asylums, a smaller number, tourist visas, which became problematic, and a few investor visas. And they only after 5 years, and after becoming imigrados, they could request to become Mexican citizens. So it was a long process. Can you imagine? Sometimes it took 10 years, and some people stayed stateless their entire life. I know at least one case in my close family that was stateless, both of them, husband and wife, their entire life. Maybe by choice, and maybe by force. So almost to end, the arrival in Mexico was sometimes happy, but not always. Sometimes was uneasy. Even when family welcomed them, not always they not always felt comfortable. Sometimes the relatives were total strangers, but they also held very different habits and values. So it was very hard to accommodate. And I know many personal stories of people leaving one home and then moving to another relative's house because they were not happy. And we see, for example, in this case, Fini Vogel, who I mentioned earlier in the 1996 interview, and actually she's still alive. So hopefully at some point she'll see this recording. She actually was sent with her parents, as I mentioned, to the Santa Rosa estate. And she uses the word camp to refer to that place. So to her, it was a hostile place. So that's also interesting how she's using that category to explain how life was there as a refugee. And she didn't have a good experience also when the Jewish family hosted her. She mentions that they didn't give her food and that even taking an apple was difficult for her because they wouldn't like it. And then almost to end. So here we get to the post-war period. And these are two immigration cards of two sisters who, I don't know how, if to say miraculously, or I don't know, they survived together. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. They were domestic workers in Sweden and finally came to Mexico in 1947. So it was quite fast compared to many others who had to wait many months and many years in many places, multiple places, before they were able to come to Mexico and reunite with their parents. So one is Itzu Rela Weiss, and the other one is Miriam, we call her Buba Weiss. And Buba is still alive, and she's 98 years old. She's the only Auschwitz survivor still alive in Mexico. Okay, sorry, I showed this before. So I won't have to go into the transit novel by Anne Segers, but it's fascinating to read it through the lens of refuge to Mexico, but also through the lens of refuge in more general terms. Here's a quote where she says how the Montreal ship went down between Dakar and Martinique, but it was due to a mine, so she calls it a natural death compared to the death of these refugees that were unable to disembark, including Mexico's ports, not only the US. The San Luis is a very famous case, but also the Cuanza and the Orinoco were unable to disembark in the port of Veracruz. And regarding, and maybe I will end with Itzu. Itzu is a very interesting case because she was a feminist, She defended the rights of ordinary, vulnerable people. I think she was not, let's say, she was more of an outlier in the Mexican landscape. And she gave her testimony to the Shoah Foundation in 1996. It's in English, by the way, if you want to listen to it. And she uses words in Spanish. Even though she's giving this interview in English, she uses words in Spanish to refer to the horrors of the Holocaust. For example, fosas, the pits, or the gas chambers, she calls them, the gas, so she uses the word in English first, and then cámaras. So I find, although I have to analyze it more carefully, that for her it was the language of a safe place that allowed her to narrate this even decades after the experience. But we can discuss that. And with that, I will conclude by saying that, I've thought a lot about whether Mexico shaped the migration experiences of these refugees and survivors. What is specific, unique about the Mexican case in comparison to other Latin American cases, but also other cases around the world? And I would argue that, yes, the Mexican context and Mexico's laws and Mexico's social and political environment and the actors that existed in Mexico and fought either against or in favor of immigration shaped the experiences of the refugees coming to this country. But also, of course, the refugees themselves have agency, and we're also trying to navigate these very hostile and difficult and challenging situations. And they found loopholes in legal loopholes, for example. They found a way to negotiate with bureaucrats. They found ways to contact high politicians that were in a very high post. And they also mobilized support from various actors. And finally, I would say that Jewish refugees and survivors, which I call them survivor refugees, because I don't like to make a very hard distinction between a refugee and a survivor, because many times survivors also call themselves refugees because they came to a new place. They had to leave their homeland. They had to create a new life. So maybe we can also discuss that, whether the categories are more fluid than in terms of their legal definition. They carried with them their memories. And Mexico also shaped those memories in very peculiar ways. So the way they remember violence, forced migration, and refuge, I would argue that we observe they're narrated in a distinctly Mexican lens. And I would finish with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yael. Don't go anywhere. We have questions. So I'm going to start us off, and I think Dr. Cohen has a list, and I'll begin with the first one. Okay. So the one that I'm curious about is, so it's evident that their experience, they had to clearly have a lot of resilience as Jewish immigrants moving into Mexico, be able to navigate life there too. And I'm unsure you can answer this fully or if it's within the scope of your research, but I wonder what kinds of communities did they end up creating when they decided to be and to either like stay in Mexico, because you did mention some of them left. And so did they ever like create their own sort of enclaves, and to what extent do these Jewish communities continue to exist in Mexico today? Or what kind of evidence is there that they were there if they're no longer there? Yeah.
Should I answer? Yes?
Yeah.
That's good. So thank you, Raquel, for the question. So yes, so to be brief. So at the time, there was a Jewish community in Mexico that was well organized and was in the process of consolidating. So some of them got affiliated to the Jewish community. Some of them, in fact, the moment they came to Mexico, we see many of these surveys that are filled out immediately after arriving. So they sought support from the Jewish community, economic support, housing support, legal support, etc. So some got affiliated to the Jewish community and or got sought support from the Jewish community that was already there. But I have to say that some of them also formed their own communities based on their place of origin. So we have Jews from Hungary and Jewish survivors and refugees from Hungary forming their own organization, or German and Austrian Jews doing the same. So we have Emuna, and Menorah, as two organizations that they created. And then years later, and I've noticed that in the US these processes began much earlier, but only in 1965, Holocaust survivors also created their own union of survivors. So that became another community of belonging for them. And now I think that the fact that many left Mexico, because initially I thought Mexico was a permanent place, but I found more and more cases of people who left. So it was also a transit place or a temporary site for many of these refugees and survivors. Maybe not for most, but yes, for many. And they also brought with them their Mexican experience to other places. So that community belonging has to be seen in a more transnational way and more fluid also.
So we're just going to change this so that our faces come up. Is that what we want? Yeah. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Is that right? Did you
Perfect.
You want to take it over, or you want me to?
We'll ask some questions from the chat, and then we'll come to our attendees here. I'm going to put... So we've had many great questions that are coming in. And one of the ones I wanted to ask you, and these are in no particular order, were the Jewish communities free to practice their faith without fear? And what role did the Catholic Church play in the resettlement of the Jewish immigrants? We've had a couple questions like that, and so let's start there.
Okay, so I think that the Mexican case is also exceptional on this matter, because I think that even though it was really hard to get in, those who were the lucky ones to get in were they were free to live their faith or experience their faith the way they wanted. And so it's like, okay, you got in, live freely, right? But they lived in an enclave also that was both religious and ethnic. And I can also developed a strong connection with Israel over time, so very Zionist also. But I think they were free to live a Jewish life, yes. That would bring me into a very difficult discussion about the 1920s and the separation between state and religion in Mexico, but that certainly played a part. So although there were conservative sectors that were anti-Semitic, at the same time, the separation between state and the church allowed Jews to just lead a free religious life.
Thank you. In terms of, we'll switch a little bit to politicians and the press. So one question, was the Mexican press covering the Holocaust and the dire circumstances of the Jews in terms of influencing public opinion about accepting refugees? And another question, and there's been a few about this, are the Jewish refugees who might have come to Mexico following their involvement in the Spanish Civil War, fighting with the Republicans.
Yes, so I do want to go first back to fear. I do think that even though there was this established Jewish community and Jews were able to lead their faith in a free way, as you know, fear is subjective. So coming from Nazi Germany or an occupied territory in Europe and having experienced persecution, some refugees and survivors decided not to belong to the Jewish community, not to be affiliated with the Jewish community. Or like one friend who's a survivor from the Łódź ghetto and who's still alive told me once, I chose to live in a neighborhood that was not too Jewish because I did not want to be in a ghetto again. So I just wanted to complete my earlier answer by saying that some people were afraid, even though the circumstances were not dangerous. And regarding the press, yes, so I was able to do some research about the coverage of the press several years ago, and some of it is in the Memory and Tolerance Museum in Mexico. You see some clips of the press and how the press covered what was happening in Europe. And I have to say that it's very, first of all, the news, they got them from other agencies, from the Associated Press, for example. So they were just republishing what was being published in the US, for example. But, and there was no, it was a very official press. At the time, the Revolutionary Institutional Party that governed the country had a very vertical control. So there was no freedom of expression in this press, so you don't find many editorials. It was very hard for me to find editorials, but there is very extensive coverage of the persecution. In fact, the word gas is mentioned, the word ghetto is mentioned. So when people say, well, in Mexico, this was not known, that's not true. The Mexican press was covering what was happening in Europe with great detail. But again, with the problems of not having a critical view on that, yes. And regarding the Spanish Republicans, yes, I mean, we have also testimonies of a survivor who said that his dad was helped by someone who was a volunteer in the international brigades. So yeah, there is that connection. I think it needs to be further explored in research, yes.
I'm going to come here to the in-person attendees.
Thank you. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the Jewish community in Mexico, which I think numbers 30,000. And if now, when I was just thinking about your president now, to have a Jewish person, although I don't know how religious she is, it must be an incredible step forward. I mean, and a woman too.
Yes. Well, so I'll address the first part. It's the easy part. We are, and I say we because I belong to this Jewish community, 40,000 Jews today. At the time of the Holocaust, there were 20,000, and the community has been pretty much stable over the years. We don't have a high rate of immigration, and we have a very low rate of exogamous marriages. I like that word instead of saying mixed or endogamous and exogamous. So only 5%. So compared to the US, I believe here it's like 45%, the same in Argentina. So Mexico is very unique it is an ethnic enclave, the community. And so regarding numbers, so something unique about the Mexican Jewish community also, it's the sub-ethnic divisions that we have, or its composition, because we are not only formed by Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, but those Jews that came from Syria mainly also have their own communities. So they have the Aleppo Jews called Halevi and the Damascus Jews called Shami. And we have synagogues, schools, and other institutions created along those ethnic national reference of identification, which is very unique very unique in the world, not only in Latin America. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just the way it is. And when refugees, going back to my presentation, when they came, and going back to Raquel's question, when they came, if they came from Greece or the Balkans, they would join the Sephardic synagogue, and they would send their kids to the Sephardic school whenever that school opened, because not every school was open early on. And if they came from Poland, they would send their kids to a school where they could be with Ashkenazi children. So that referent of identification was also very key in the ways in which refugees and survivors developed a concrete way of belonging, not only a feeling of belonging.
So you have a lot of Jewish professionals too today?
No, we have a very diverse community. Yes, professionals, more and more. The younger generation, more and more professionals, because Again, going back to the past, when they came, they had to be many times peddlers because they didn't have work permits. It was very hard. So that's why family was not only a very key unit of survival during the Holocaust, but they became, I put it in my presentation and didn't mention it, they were not only helpers so that the refugees could migrate, but also hosts. They welcomed them in their homes. Whether that worked out or not, that's another story. And it didn't work out well for everybody. But they welcomed them in their homes. They helped them find a job. Sometimes they would work with a relative because they didn't have the legal authorization to work, because also the law prohibited that the refugees, well, they were called immigrants, not refugees. They were later called or considered racial refugees, but they were considered immigrants. So the immigrants were prohibited to work in any job that from which they profited, because that would, according to the narrative of the time, it would affect local workers. So that was another fear going on there. Yes. I hope regarding the president, I don't want to...
Want to say Frida, that painter, that Frida something, her father was, I think, a Russian Jew.
That's true. Yes, that is true. So many intellectuals, but they decided, some of them, not to be affiliated with the Jewish community because their worldview led them somewhere else. They wanted to be fully integrated into society. They wanted to belong to other communities, which were left-wing, no, socialist, communist, Stalinist, Trotskyists, you name it, yes. So, and regarding the president, I invite you to read an article that was published in the Forward about her Jewish roots and her Holocaust history, because I don't have time to answer that. Yes.
So we have just a couple of questions, and then I'll ask a larger question. So I'm curious, you just mentioned the current president of Mexico. So there's a question also about the involvement of Mexican politicians at the time. Someone talks about their grandparents being let into Mexico in the 40s through the involvement of the president of Mexico. There's another question regarding, were there any altruistic diplomats in Europe who assisted Jewish folks in coming to Mexico? And did anyone have to bribe Mexican officials to be let in?
Well, the last part, of course. I said that before. It's, of course, very hard to document that, right? But the statement by Kalmar is so powerful. So we were the last ones to disembark from this ship because we didn't bribe anyone. And actually, we didn't know we had to bribe someone to be able to disembark. And also, he didn't have any relatives. So he was also not helped in his disembarkation through relatives who probably also bribed someone. So yes, but it is hard to document. So that's why I mentioned that I see gaps in the files, and I wonder. So this issue was finally solved with money. Otherwise, how come you see, no, I'm sorry, Mr. blah, 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 to reject your application. Yes, I understand your niece is a child survivor of the Holocaust. However, we're unable to let her in. Those are the types, not even explaining why. And then suddenly, she gets an approval. So I'm not saying corruption is the only explaining factor, but it did play an important role. And it still does today. So we live in a country with 98% of impunity. And regarding the president, there is an interesting case, for example, of Belgian Jews who worked in the diamond business, and through the intermediation of the Mexican consul in Marseille, Gilberto Bosques, President Cárdenas eventually allowed them to come in, but for some reason that was then annulled, like it didn't work out. But I think the question is more profound. When there was political willingness on the part of President Cárdenas, people were let in. And that peak that I show you in the graph, it still deserves much more explaining. How did that happen? Was it maybe personal decisions on specific cases, maybe high political contacts, maybe corruption, maybe I don't know, multiple ways in which the families navigated the hostility, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a question about the European people helping, no? Or,
I think, was there a Mexican diplomat in Europe helping facilitate
so
immigration?
maybe they're referring to Gilberto Bosques, but there is a lot of controversy about the figure of, surrounding the figure of Gilberto Bosques, and I don't have time, but you can read Daniela Glazer's work, because there is a collective imaginary of Gilberto Bosques being a rescuer, and in fact, he provided the visas that President Cárdenas authorized for those Jews that were left-wing and either socialist, communists. So those were welcomed. That was a very strong conviction on the part of Cárdenas. So Bosques did not go against the will of the president. So he has not been recognized as a righteous among the nations for, among other reasons. One reason is that he was just following the instructions of the president. But at the same time, there is evidence that some people who solicited from him an entry visa to the country were denied that visa. And also some people tell in their testimonies, even people who later on said he was a hero, because I can understand it. For them, he was. Finally, that was the only way to get in, and so he was a heroic figure for them. But they also tell how they had to go back and back to his office and sat down with him multiple times. So it seems like it was not immediate that he would grant that visa. So it's more complex.
It's very clear from all of the questions coming up in the chat. This is a topic of enormous interest to people. And I guess one of the questions, I actually have two for you, they're related. And one is, how can we share this important memory? There's clearly a demand for it, and even when you and I have been talking and doing in collaboration with research and translating that you're doing, there are so many microhistories and national histories across the Spanish-speaking world in connection to the Holocaust. So that's my first question, is how to make this history more accessible for people. And then I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about language of safety. And you translated our audio tour of the Nazi concentration camps exhibition. And in the process of translating, we spoke a lot about what words remain in English versus Spanish. We talked a lot about the use of gender, and we talked a lot about how do you convey this in a way that is authentic and critical in Spanish, that also lives up or has the same level of impact as the English translation.
So thank you, Laura, for your great questions. I'll start with the last one. I think language is profoundly emotional. So if you use one word to describe an experience or a different one, you're evoking different feelings to not only a definition or a simple, straightforward meaning. There are layers of meaning and there are emotions that accompany that. So that's why we had these discussions about what words to use, because also in the US context, a word may mean one thing and a translated word in a Latin, and I have to say there are multiple Latin spaces or Hispanic or Latin American, even those words can be used in many different ways, because what we understand in Mexico may be different from what people understand in Ecuador. And I know now that you have many students, for example, from Ecuador. So we have to be very careful also. And I think this interculturality has to be very central to the work we do, both in research and in teaching. It entails being sensitive to the otherness, any otherness, and even someone who you think is so similar to you. You find that person may also understand that word in different ways. So yes, the language of safety is the language that you can use freely, the language that you can use comfortably, the language that comes from your soul. It's many things, I think. And that's why I was appalled by the fact that Itzu was referring to the horrors of her experience in Spanish. She didn't, I know she stumbled sometimes because of the effort to translate, just like I'm doing now as I'm speaking. If I gave this talk in Spanish, it would be much easier. But it was not only the stumbling with the translation, it was really what she really wanted to convey, and only the Spanish word did it for her. And she was born in Romania, so I think Mexico became a good refuge for her, a home. It became a home. It's the language of home. And regarding the public, how do we can share? There are multiple ways. There are materials in English, there are materials in Spanish, and I so much thank you for being concerned and sensitive to having this exhibit also in Spanish, because I think that's so important. So more translations should be done and more circulation. Let's find ways to circulate knowledge transnationally. I think that's another important way to do so.
Thank you. I'd like to turn it back over to Raquel to say some final words. No? Final words. Okay. All right. Thanks to everyone who joined us in person today. I also want to thank everyone who joined us online. I know there were a lot of questions. Feel free to email the center, khc@qcc.cuny.edu. If you're online, that email address will be in the post-event follow-up, and we'll be more than happy to forward our comments to Yael. And I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. We hope you stay safe during these uncertain times. Be well.